lazy, soft, entitled, don't want to work. These are all criticisms constantly being thrown at Gen Z by older generations. If you're a young Zoomer, I imagine how much you must be sick of all this. So, we're going to go ahead and debunk all of these in this video right now. Number 1, lazy. This is by far the most common criticism levied against Gen Z, but it's actually really easy to debunk. Laziness does not exist. This is one of the most thought-provoking books I've ever read, and it makes several great points. There's always a level of reward where even the laziest person would be motivated to work hard. For example, a young person might not want to flip burgers, but if you offered him $1 million to do so, I guarantee he'd do it. Before you start typing in the comments, I'm not saying a fast food worker should make $1 million, but I am saying that the reason Gen Z doesn't want to work is not because of laziness. It's because in this economy, there just isn't enough reward and incentive for working to be worth their time. If anything, you can blame the older generation's laziness for the situation we currently find ourselves in. Boomers were handed a booming post-war economy where everyone could easily get a decent paying job out of high school. They ruined the economy and were too lazy to maintain it for future generations. They're too lazy to clean up the mess that they themselves created. There's a lot of young people on welfare and disability these days, and older generations often use this to fuel their criticism of Gen Z. They have the right idea but the wrong culprit. If you work a 9 to 5, you should be making significantly more than welfare money. If your bosses and CEOs refuse to pay you more than what you'd receive on welfare, there's no logical reason to work. If you want to blame someone for being lazy, you can blame bosses for being too lazy to pay decent enough wages. And you can blame boomers for being too lazy to fix the economy they ruined. As this comment puts it perfectly right here, your two options these days are 1, work and be poor, or 2, don't work and be poor. So as you can see, it's not that they're lazy, it's that modern society and economic conditions just don't give them enough incentive to work. Free market economics goes both ways. If a pizza costs $10, I can choose to buy it or not. But I'm not entitled to the pizza, and I can't shame the restaurant for being lazy and not selling me the pizza for cheaper. And in the same exact way, if you're not willing to pay Gen Z enough that they actually want to work, you're not entitled to their labor. And you have to either pay them more or accept that they're not going to work for the dogshit wages you want to pay. Number 2, entitled. Gen Z is often called entitled by people who don't really even know what that word means. So let's first properly define it as, this is the key to understanding it. According to the dictionary, the word entitled means believing oneself to be inherently deserving of privileges or special treatment. Now, the economy these days is so bad that I'm not sure it's even possible to think about or want privileges or special treatment. Most Gen Z just want basic food and shelter, as that's all they can really even think about affording. This is important to define because these delusional boomers have twisted meanings and definitions so much in their shameless gaslighting and manipulation of the youth. Have we literally devolved and got to a point where basic food and housing is considered a special privilege? Boomers would certainly consider you entitled if you said housing was a basic human right. Unfortunately for them, the US government and the United Nations themselves disagree. In 1948, in front of the UN and the entire international community, the US signed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights Agreement, where it was explicitly stated that housing is a basic human right. Yes, let me repeat, a basic human right and not a service you have to pay for. In the same way, freedom of speech is considered a right that you don't have to pay or work for. And yet, you got these delusional boomers claiming that Gen Z is entitled for not wanting to spend 60% of their whole paycheck on something that the US government explicitly agreed is a human right in front of the entire international community and the UN. So who's really the entitled one here? Maybe it's time boomers look themselves in the mirror and realize They're the ones who are entitled for thinking. They're entitled to $7 an hour cheap youth labor in this era where living expenses have clearly soared way beyond that. Number 3, soft. Gen Z is often called soft because they won't tolerate workplace abuse and toxicity that older generations just took up the ass. This is one of those things where it just all depends on your perspective. You could say that standing there and just eating it when someone disrespects you to your face is brave, courageous, or whatever the opposite of soft is. But personally, I think it's the opposite. Allowing yourself to be constantly chewed out by your boss without standing up for yourself is actually what got us into this mess in the first place. The whole idea of just doing what you're told and not asking questions. I remember the bravest thing I ever did in high school was the day I finally stood up to my bully and he eventually backed down and stopped bothering me. And one thing you quickly realize when you become an adult is that bullies are everywhere in the workplace, just like they are in high school. And I personally don't think it's soft to stand up against these bullies and not let them disrespect you. In fact, quite the opposite. You're actually soft if you don't stand up to them. Another reason Gen Z gets called soft is this line I'm sure you've heard a million times from your boomer parents. Your grandfathers went out and died in wars while you sit on the couch playing war video games. The most ironic thing about this statement is that boomers go around preaching this all day, but boomers themselves never actually fought in or experienced World War II. They just benefited from the post-war economic boom that happened afterwards. The one war they did fight in was the Vietnam War, and they were disgustingly disrespectful to the point of spitting on veterans of the Vietnam War when they came home. But if the willingness to die for a cause is what defines the courage of a generation, Gen Z is more than willing to step up to the plate. Countless Zoomers have made viral videos now about how they'd rather die than work a soul-sucking 9 to 5. To me, sacrificing yourself for your own mental health and enjoyment is a way more noble cause than for a country that kills innocent people around the world and doesn't care about its own citizens either. Number 4, Insel. This insult really isn't to be taken seriously anymore. It used to mean an angry guy who couldn't get laid, but at this point, it just means anyone who voted for Trump or disagrees with leftist, feminist ideologies. Countless angry feminists came out of the woods to label Gen Z men as incels after Trump won the election. But being someone who hangs out with a lot of Zoomers myself, this couldn't be further from the truth. Between video games, prawn, VR, and all the other entertainment vices available today, there's just so many distractions available to young men now that chasing women is really optional at this point. On top of that, they've seen how many men of older generations got wrecked in relationships and in divorce court, and as a result are a lot more capable of realizing the juice ain't worth the squeeze. There's certainly some young guys who are desperately trying to get a girlfriend and can't. But I've seen just as many tall and good-looking Gen Z guys who just can't be bothered with women and would rather focus on themselves. So overall, while there are some incels in Gen Z, I don't think there's more of them than in any other generation. They're more of a men going their own way generation than anything else. Number 5, young, stupid, and naive. To be fair, this isn't a criticism that's specific to Gen Z. It's more so directed at every young generation when they come of age. It makes sense when you think about it as, when you're young, you've just had less time to learn things. That being said, I actually think Gen Z is the first young generation that bucks this trend. This is because they've grown up with infinite information accessible to them at a click of a button. A lot of people criticize them as being this brain rot, social media generation, but to be honest, I personally don't see this. Every generation is pretty hooked on their phones at this point, as they're just way too addicting. If anything, I've seen a shocking amount of Zoomer intellectuals all over YouTube, with incredibly deep understandings of history, politics, and more. Because they grew up in such a rapidly changing time, they're also aware of how fast the world changes, and as a result, they're super adaptable at a moment's notice. Compare this with the average boomer who's still stuck in the 1960s and still doesn't know how to make a Facebook account. All their extra wisdom and knowledge is completely irrelevant, as the world has changed way too much for them to really understand anything. Number 6, don't want to work. Now, unlike every other criticism on this list, this one is actually true. Most young people now definitely don't want to work anymore. So I'm not really going to be debunking it in the sense of proving it's not true, because it is. But I am going to be debunking the notion that it's a bad thing. In fact, I think it is a very good thing. Here's why. For way too long, our whole lives have revolved around our work. If you're lucky, you work from 9 to 5, meaning you spend over half of all your waking hours working. The overwhelming majority of people don't like their jobs. They're just doing it because they need the money. I'm not even talking about how bad the economy is now and how the low wages and high living expenses today have made working totally not worth it. That's just the cherry on top. But even if you made 6 figures a year, but absolutely hated your job, what's even the point? Sure, you make a lot of money, but with how busy you are, you don't even have any time to enjoy the money. There has to be more to life than just being a money printing machine. And Gen Z is the first generation to really realize this. We are not physically meant to work, and the science proves it. Work-related stress has been proven to cause so many health issues, it's not even funny. If we were meant to work, it would make us physically healthier, but instead it does the exact opposite. Now, what's the solution to all this? That is something that us young people will have to figure out. Maybe we'll find ways to work non-traditional 9 to 5s that give us more freedom. Maybe we'll make universal basic income a reality when AI is advanced enough. There's a lot of work to do before we figure out the solution to all this. But the good news is, Gen Z is still very young, and they have many decades ahead of them to work this all out. One thing is for sure, I'm definitely looking forward to the day, some 10, 20 years later, when they're in charge and running things. Number 7, they should be grateful. They have it better than anyone in human history. And for our last one, we're going to be debunking what has become my favorite criticism of Gen Z to debunk, the notion that they have it better than anyone in human history. The big problem with this statement is that no one who says it has actually researched human history to see if this is even true. They just mindlessly throw that statement out there, assuming that things always improve with time. But this is far from the case. Technology has gotten to a point where it definitely does as much harm as it does good. And the improvements in technology also mean Gen Z has to work more and deal with way more competition than any generation in human history. For example, medieval peasants had anywhere between 30 to 50 days of religious holidays per year, and on top of that, had entire winters off, as it was too cold to plant crops. Up until the internet was invented, you only had to compete against people in your own town for decent paying jobs. Now, you have to literally compete against the entire world. The isolation caused by technology also means that Gen Z has way less support from their families and their communities than ever before. And even from a pure economic standpoint, wages are so bad now and inflation is so high that Gen Z actually has significantly worse purchasing power than people who lived through the Great Depression. Yes, you heard that right. This is a historical fact and not an opinion. So there you go. These are all the 7 most often used criticisms against Gen Z, debunked by yours truly, the millennial defense lawyer for Gen Z. Now, I know you're probably curious about the last thing I said, which is that Gen Z actually has significantly worse purchasing power than people in the Great Depression. You probably have a hard time believing this and want to know more. Don't worry, I got you. I made an entire 12-minute video specifically dedicated to this topic, which you can check out right here.